Let me stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Let me share my screen too. It changes every time with Zoom, which screen it is. There we go. Okay, so we're talking about security today. I'm going to start the conversation off with a basic demo built right into XAF, and the other guys will talk about how to take that and put it into other non-XAF applications as well, which is really kind of cool. So I created a fairly straightforward, very straightforward XAF application using the project wizard. I included the standard authentication, which then brings in the security strategy complex and the authentication standard as part of my solution. And what that ends up doing is giving you the standard username and password prompt. First and foremost, the really cool thing that I've always loved about the security system is that it is heavily customizable. So what comes out of the box is fantastic. If you find that there's a need to refine it even further, the whole API is open, so you can modify with it and work with it as you need, which is really quite amazing. So out of the box, basically, I've created a few business objects in here. When you first log in, if you added the security modules during the project wizard, a couple of roles and users are automatically set up. So you'll see here I have, let me get this out of here. So I have 2 users and 2 roles out of the box. Those are created as part of the database update, updater.cs. Again, if you don't want them, pull them out, but at least gets you started. So these users are from the permission policy user, and the roles are permission policy role classes that are included as part of the base implementation. They implement things like the I permission policy role. So if you want to do your own custom users and roles, you can go that deep. And we'll talk about that quickly after. But let's have a look at roles. Roles are where the majority of your security is defined. Again, you can extend it further. And there's been a few improvements over the last few years, which are really quite nice. So with any role, you can attach users. When we get into type permissions, we have type permissions, navigation permissions, and denied actions. And these are the navigation permissions and denied actions are the kind of newest additions. So let's have a look at our type permissions. For some reason I don't have access to this. Oh, right. These are
Yeah.
currently unavailable because is administrative is checked
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Kills me every time. So when you're an administrator, you have full rights to everything. There's no restrictions put in place at all. When you are a non-administrative user, when I uncheck this, the options become available to add these type permissions, navigation permissions, and denied actions. I'll go back to the other users, or the other role, sorry, so I don't screw that one up. So I have in my application, just to give you an idea, I have clients. Clients have a collection of locations and a location of contacts, and my contacts can work within certain locations. So I can take one out, so on and so forth. So pretty simple setup. When I declare my rules, now I'm working with kind of those types. So let me go into my user permissions, and you can see, other than contact, these 4 permissions are brought in by default as part of that updater.cs. When I add the contact one, now I can specify permissions directly related to a contact. Before we get too deep into that, we should decide whether or not we're going to allow people to access everything by default or deny them by default, or make them read-only. So this is another option that's implemented fairly recently. There's been a few iterations of the security system, but I think by default it's set to deny all by default. So basically, any user that comes in, they have 0 access. They're not allowed to touch anything. If you change that to read-only, okay, you can read, but you can't write, you can't delete, you can't create new. Or if you allow all, Now you're saying they have access to everything, and we're going to start revoking access. Depending on your scenario and how tight, how big and complex and how tight your security needs to be, one of these options will make more sense to the other. I'm going to go ahead and say allow all by default, and I'm going to turn off the features I don't want certain users to have. And so one of those features I put in here was under the company contacts, I have a driver's license number. This could be a social security number. It could be anything. I want to make it so that users cannot see that value. So I'm going to go into my security role. I'm going to add my contacts. I have nothing specified in here. So it's going to default to whatever my role was, which is allow all by default. And then I'm going to go in and either add member permissions or object permissions. So if I want to turn off an individual member, I'm going to do that inside the member permissions. And what's really cool about this is that you get into, it's on the wrong screen, you get into your role, you can set up the criteria to say, yeah, they can read their own driver's license number, but they're not allowed to read other users' driver's license numbers. So I'm going to turn off the read on this for all. They can't read their own or anybody else's. I set the read to deny. The right shouldn't matter because we'll be able to read it anyway. Save and close, save my role. So when I log in here now as a user, we quickly see, whoops, wrong screen. We quickly see that under contacts, their driver's license has been kind of like a password character has been removed. So, Dennis, did this change? This used to say like content unavailable or whatever, protected content. Was this a recent change? Do you know? Not there. Okay. Yeah, fairly recent, I believe. These were changed to different characters. I think you can define those characters in the model file as well. So outside of that, we've locked that down. Let's go to log out. Let's log in as admin. So those are in the type permissions. So we took it down to the individual member. You can go down and invoke many members based on the same rule set. So if I put in some criteria here that says they can only read their own, or they're not their own, then I can say not only this member, but they're not allowed to see their last name either. So you can do multiple in these member permissions, and then set the read and write. So that's really, really, really specific. You can then go up one level. So you know what? It's not based on permissions. It's the type altogether. So let's say work locations. Sorry, 1 second here. Contacts. Here we go. So my criteria is going to be if it's not their own user. Current user ID. That's handy. Then I am not allowed to read. So that's on the object level as a whole. Delete that one. That was a mistake. So now when I log in as a user, when I look at contacts, I should only be able to see myself. Contacts. So they can't see last name. Now, of course, that's silly because the contact is not actually a user. So that actually brings me to another piece, which we'll get to shortly. So that's the basics of type permissions, right? You're defining that for this type, you're either allowed to read, allowed to write, create, or delete. You can go down to the object level and say, if it's this type of object, or if the first name starts with whatever, they're not allowed to see it. So you add criteria, and you say, if it matches this criteria, here are the rules for the object as a whole. If you want to get down more specific, you're doing the same thing, but now you can apply which members that applies to. So these type permissions give you, the most robust flexibility in terms of defining those roles. What we tend to see is a lot of people putting in filters automatically into views, into collection lookups, that type of thing, to say, hey, you're not allowed to look at this, and you're really stepping on the toes of the security system. You should try to let the security system do as much as you can, and then just apply your little changes on top of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Navigation permissions. So if you want to turn off certain navigation items, my navigation is extremely simple. But if I don't want these users to be able to look at even my details, or I don't want to let them look at roles, I can turn off the navigation on those. The same thing applies for denied actions. So here will be my list of actions, and I have one called add all locations. So if you're looking at a contact and you see their list of locations, there's a button there to add all locations. Same thing, I can turn that off, and then users won't be able to see that. So that's the basics of setting up roles. You obviously assign your users to roles. There is some complexity about having multiple users in multiple roles. That is not going to be included in this part of the demo, but we may talk about that later on. We should talk a little bit about the underlying types. So when I go and I look at my Win application here, again, we use a security strategy complex with the authentication standard. There are other authentication types. Down over here, we have the authentication Active Directory. This is particularly useful in a Windows scenario where it basically takes the logged in username and applies that as the user. And you have the options to automatically create that user or have to have it predefined. You can also create your own authentication strategies as well. So if you want to do your OAuth or something completely custom, you can create your own, and then you're just dragging it onto here or defining it here. In the security strategy complex, this is where the user and role types are defined. So over here in our properties, we have our role type, which is our permission policy role, and our user type, which is permission policy user. If you need to use custom security users and roles, so maybe you want to add, first name, last name, email to a user, have them log in and have them more information. There's a couple ways to do that. The easiest one is to extend the permission policy user class and the permission policy role class. We typically do that and do our map inheritance as well. If you haven't seen that before, let me add that really quickly here. So I'm going to add an employee. My employee I'm going to make, and get the stuff out of here. So normally we do base object, we're going to do permission policy user. Okay. So normally this would create a separate table for my employee with the additional fields. To do things in a single table, we're going to do a map inheritance, the parent table. So it's going to store all of my new fields into that permission policy user table. If I can type today, last name, perfect. If you do this, if you create and extend the permission policy user and permission policy role, be aware that in your updater, updater.cs, you need to go back and modify these pieces because they are creating, permission policy users, and you need to put in your own type. Okay, let me resolve that quickly. And there, I'm going to start up a new database for this because otherwise we have to go back and change the object types. I don't feel like doing that for a demo. The last thing we need to do is actually go into our Win application. This is going to change once we get into the Blazor side of things, as the designers are not going to be included, at least not immediately. And what I do is I'm just going to build this quickly. Build. So make sure the security strategy complex is selected, come down to your user type, and now I should be able to pick my employee from here. There it is. Okay. So I'm logging in as admin. It's going to create my new database for me, set up my default user, my default roles. Very slowly today, apparently. There we go. On the wrong screen again. There we go. So my employees are here. These are security users, just like we had before. But now I have the options for first name and last name. In the back end, they're still all being stored in that permission policy user table. But it gives me more flexibility, more options. The other option is to implement the interfaces for the iPermission policy user, iPermission policy role, and the other relevant interfaces that go along with security if you want to do that. So that's a little bit more complex. It gives you kind of the ultimate flexibility. You're not relying on the underlying types. So it's a bit more work, but it does give you much more flexibility.
Yeah, by the way, we will have these current options with employee class implemented in Solution Wizard by default this year.
Oh, very nice.
It's most used.
That's great. Yeah, I've seen a couple people do very custom implementations using the interfaces. 99% of the time, I see people do an extension of the permission policy user and permission policy role, and I've never seen anybody really have a problem with that. So I'm glad to hear that's coming. There's some nuances, some complexities in terms of related objects. I won't really get into details on those at this point, but there are, collection. The other one here. There are some collection related and especially particularly aggregated objects that when they have a relationship type in these type permissions, the security system will make some assumptions for you in terms of if you have the rights to read that type, then the collection of that object within the the containing type will automatically link up. So if I have clients and contacts in here, if I add rights to clients and I add rights to contacts, it's automatically going to assume that I can read the contacts within that client. If we go back to the designer again, and we click on the security strategy complex again, you can see that association permissions mode up here. So by default, it's set to auto. There is extended, the extended auto, which is a little bit slower, but does have, I think, a little bit more flexibility. And then there's manual, where you basically have to define rules on both sides of the objects to enforce those relationships. So be aware that that is there as well. Certainly recommend reading some documentation on that. There is the basic security. I mean, we can probably link these after. So here's a good article on the security system as a whole. There is another one on permissions for aggregate objects, associated objects, and how that works. So another great piece of documentation. And then there is one for when you're creating the manual association permissions. So those are three that we should, Jose, we can link those at the end and make those available. They really clearly define how the security system works in the background and the little nuanced rules.
Nice.
Beautiful.
Hey, thank you, Dave. That was a great overview, a great introduction, and I wouldn't call it an introduction. It covered almost everything that we need to have in account in our security system, and definitely Dennis already put the link on the chat, but I will probably add it to the YouTube video then later on, so you always also have access to that one. So I'm gonna share my screen for just a second. And a few things that I would like to add. Dave, the change was in 20.2.1. It changed from protecting content to asterisk, as you were saying, because it's it's a better user experience, I would say, that the protected content behavior before. I also want to point out that Fernando was asking about some type of cloning the permission or to get it up to speed quickly. And one solution that Danny provides is using the clone module to clone those objects. But also you can also use this example that Express has here of how to use the generate the database updated code. So you can just pretty much copy that code into your application on those permissions, your roles get generated based in the role that you define in your UI. So this is a really nice solution. I actually have a video on my channel about this. I really recommend it. I also want to point out that I have seen a lot of software that I have been using SAF for a few years already, and they are using the old security system user security system role, and they haven't still migrated. So this is also a great link that they can use to finally move their whole implementation to the new approach that it has a lot of new advantages, a lot of new features. And one link that I really like is the landing page from the security system. Right here, we have a really nice visualization of how the security system works, about the authorization part, the authentication part, and how this is not only for SAF. And we're going to show now a few demos using SAF security in non-SAF app, but pretty much it's a common API. When you go and check the code that the designer got generated for you, is actually doing the same thing that we will be doing now, but it makes it so easy for you. And Dennis can correct me if I'm wrong, but the security system have more than 10,000 unit tests. So definitely that's not something that you want to implement yourself. Certainly that is a great tool that you can reuse. And especially us that we really like SAF, pretty much every time that I'm going to do any type of application, even if it's not going to be SAF, I put SAF as my backend and I just reuse my authorization, my authentication, my security thing. And also right here, there are demos with security implemented in almost everywhere that you want in .NET, in WinForms, Console, Web Forms, Xamarin, Blazor, MVC, DevExtreme. So again, the demos that we are going to show is nothing, is already available for you. It's right there in GitHub. Just go there, run it, play with it, understanding, and you will see how comprehensive and how granular the security system can be.